Thanks, Debs. Yeah, Caroline, thank you so much. We've actually missed you. Lots of people have spoken about data privacy, and we've had one other chat on ISO, but that was ISO 8000. So look forward to the ISO 27000. It's certainly I've certainly noticed a lot more courses being given, especially in Saudi, on ISO 27000. So it really seems like that area is growing in popularity. I'm not sure how you're finding it. Is it something that you've been focusing on lately quite a bit?
I have been focusing on it. It is a good standard. I'll be
Right.
politically correct. I just think that it is marketed very well, and I think there are an awful lot of consulting companies offering it, and therefore everybody asks for it. So, and what I found is that corporates tend to ask for it as part of their due diligence, or investors ask for it as part of their due diligence. So it's got a lot of traction. I found that in the United States, SOC 2 would be more prevalent than ISO.
Yeah.
So I think it is a regional thing. But interesting to hear that it's rising in Saudi as well.
Yeah, Saudi's big, so most of the times when we're doing CDMP training, there's somebody doing ISO 27000 training. So I think we have Adolfo here. I'm not sure, Adolfo, are you from Saudi? Just to check if you're dealing with the 27000 as well? Okay. All right. All yours, Caroline. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay. Well, we'll get cracking. So thanks very much for inviting me to speak. It's always nice to meet up with you guys and to facilitate these meetups. Right. So let's get cracking. So first of all, just to let you know, if you want to continue this conversation with me, I have several pages on LinkedIn where you can connect and keep up to date with this type of information on knowwhatskills.tech. So knowwhatskills.tech is an initiative that I've undertaken under the banner of Clearwood, our consulting firm. But that's where I'm going to be catching all of this type of know-how and feedback. So just a bit about me. I've been around the block a few times, been in technology for longer than I care to admit. Yeah, please do reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always very keen to meet with people and track how people are doing.
So just a quick question, Caroline. I see the SFIA version 9 came out yesterday.
Yes, it did.
Are you aware of the changes?
Yeah. I attended their webinar today. Their launch webinar today. I'm very excited about it. It looks really good. It's
just a quick summary.
Really
what
nicely.
Changed?
They've made some things. They've obviously modernized for a lot more of the roles. So they've they introduced a lot more sort of AI, obviously, AI roles.
Okay.
And they've also expanded out things like marketing and stuff like that. But on the whole, they've also just made it a lot more. They've done a lot more profiles, and they've kind of made it more accessible. So it's just the website's a bit easier and there's a lot more sort of connecting of information. But it's an amazing amount of work, honestly. I'm very impressed with the amount of work that they've done. So yeah, now we all have to go back and get our Sophia badges updated. That's another day's work. Okay. So all right, so we're going to talk about POPI today. Please note that I am not a lawyer. Clearwood Consulting is not a practice, a legal practice, and nothing that I say here today constitutes advice, and nor does it guarantee that you will be POPI compliant. Okay, first of all, we're going to be dealing with POPI. So just a very quick introduction, just in case anybody isn't aware or sure, especially any international guests. POPIA is the South African privacy legislation. It is 80% the same as every other privacy legislation in the world, because they all come out of the OECD guidelines. And so many of the concepts that I touch on today, the wording might be slightly different in your part of the world, but I promise you there'll be a similar approach or a similar principle applied. And just so that you know, POPI is the protection of personal information, and POPIA is the act that is our legislation in South Africa. So just some very quick terminology, just so that you understand. The information regulator is the, can you see my mouse, by the way? I don't think you can. There. Can you see my mouse?
Yes.
So the information regulator is our supervisory authority, as you would have in the EU, or I think I can't remember what Canada calls it, but the information regulator, they all get together. They have a nice big club now, and they all talk to each other, and they're all kind of aligning on
Yeah.
how they're managing things. And there's just, by the way, a lot of activity in Africa as well. So there's an enormous amount of coming together. I've been monitoring the changes in privacy legislation across Africa because it impacts on South African companies that are marketing into African markets. Your data subject is, as you would expect, the people whose information is being collected. So that would be your staff if you have nothing else, but definitely your customers, suppliers, charities. And something that's interesting and different in POPIA is to most of the legislations, except I think for I think it was Switzerland, but they might be changing it. So in POPI legislation considers a legal entity a data subject. So if there's a company, they can have personal information and they can apply POPI. Anyway, whoever's collecting the data in the middle here, they are the responsible party. In GDPR, you would call that a controller. As I said, these roles are all pretty much the same. The terminology just changes. And then anybody or any systems or applications that you're leveraging become your operators. So they are anybody who isn't under your direct control, so not an employee, but these are your service providers, software providers, vendors, anybody who is crunching personal information for you, storing it, archiving it, backing it up, whatever. In the responsible party, according to law, the head of the organization is named as an information officer. That can be a little confusing. The terminology is not great. I would prefer a privacy officer or a privacy compliance officer. It's a compliance role. But in POPI, actually in PIA, the previous, the sister legislation, they defined the information officer as being the head of the organization. And there's guidelines that literally say if you're a sole proprietor, it's you. If you are, P2I Limited, it's the CEO or managing director. So they've literally gone down and said who that person is. And that person is the sole responsibility, carries full accountability for what happens to all the personal information in your data flows. So the buck stops with this person. And the trick with it is, as we're going to ISO 27000, looking at it now, it's just to remember that accountability is assigned according to law. Okay. Any questions on that or any confusion about any of that?
Yeah, so I don't know if Saudi actually released their PDPL last year, and they talk about a DPO, which is the Data Privacy Officer.
Yeah, the DPO. And GDPR also talks about a DPO. What's different in GDPR, I don't know about Saudi, but in GDPR, the DPO is not a mandatory role.
Okay.
So it's something there are thresholds that you meet, and then
Right.
it becomes mandatory. Whereas in South Africa, it's a named role, even if you're a sole proprietor. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so when it comes to information security, let's see what it is that POPI wants. So just going to quickly fly through this. Section 19 talks about information security. That's the bit we're going to dig into. But just for completeness, the other types of things it talks about, obviously, is managing data breaches, which would fall under our incident management. It talks about managing your third party. So that would be supplier management, supplier relationship management, vendor management, third party risk management, whatever you want to call it. And very particular requirements for your third parties and specifically your operators, most notably that you must have contracts with them. Sorry. And then Section 8 is alluding to privacy by design. POPI doesn't name it as privacy by design or security by design. Lawfulness would include security by design, but it does allude to it. GDPR names it as privacy by design and security by design, and also privacy by default and security by default. So those are legislated in GDPR. So we tend to just accept that it's privacy and security by design must be baked in. So that's just a very quick overview of the sort of some of the touch points in POPI. So this is the Condition 7 security guard safeguards, and Section 19 falls under Condition 7's requirement for security safeguards, and it's kind of wordy, and I'm going to break this down. That's the point of this presentation. So to get started, the first thing is we need to secure the integrity and confidentiality of personal information. Obviously, you're going to secure the integrity and confidentiality of all information, but POPI is mostly concerned with personal information. So personal information needs to be a category of information, and that was where DAMA and DAMA comes in, and where we looked at the information lifecycle last year. So yeah, it's a category of information that also needs to have integrity and confidentiality. Integrity means it's not messed around with. The POPIA section 19 states that you need to take appropriate, reasonable, technical and organizational measures to prevent the loss, damage, or unauthorized destruction or unlawful access to data or the unlawful processing of data. In other words, you need to have authorized access so that nobody's messing with the data who shouldn't be there. You need to take reasonable measures to identify all reasonably foreseeable internal and external risks. You need to establish and maintain appropriate safeguards against the risks identified. You need to regularly verify that the safeguards are effectively implemented. And you need to ensure that the safeguards are continually updated. Especially because obviously you're going to identify new risks. You're going to identify deficiencies in your safeguards, and also obviously there's change. You have to respond to change, and then you need to give due regard according to law, according to POPI. You need to give due regard to generally accepted information security practices and procedures, which may apply generally or may be required in terms of public industry, specific industry or professional rules and regulations. And they're referring there to, for example, the financial industry, the finance industry or medical industry. They have very specific data protections and confidentiality requirements and integrity requirements. And POPI basically is a stacking legislation. What it does is it says if there is another law, like anything to do with the medical fraternity, if there is another law that provides greater protection, then that law applies. If there isn't an equivalent law, equivalent protection, then POPI applies. So that's how that stacks up. But interesting to note that you have to give due regard to generally accepted information security practices. You can't just decide, I'm going to decide what security means to me and write up my own sweet little framework. All right, so just to unpack that, integrity and confidentiality maps to all information security frameworks, address the CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information assets. And then if you're in software, I will put an S on that as well for safety. Then the technical and organizational measures are your map to that almost exact wording that you'll find in security frameworks, where they will talk about technical measures, they'll talk controls, they'll talk about organizational controls, they'll talk about procedural controls. There's always a requirement. So in POPI, it's talking about the cyclical management of risk. So assess your risks and then assess them again and see if you need to address any new issues. All security frameworks have risk management at their core. So they're all about prioritizing risk based on your technology stack, your industry, your business, the context of your organization. And then when we talk about generally accepted information security practice, there is literally more than you want to have to know about. There really is an endless supply of practices and procedures. The point is that you give cognizance to them and you select the one that is best for your business. But as I said at the intro, ISO 27000 does get a lot of traction and does get a lot of airtime. So we usually end up needing to know about it, if nothing else. Right.
Sorry, could I ask a question, Caroline?
Sure.
If we could go back. So there are a couple of things. One is this cyclical management of risks. That if I'm correct, that risk classification was CRD or critical risk data, and then they had high risk data, and I think there were three levels of risk classification, which is, I'm assuming that's not the same as personal information classification, and that's not the same as the NIST.
Okay, so you're talking about information classification.
Yeah.
So when I look at data, I need to label it and know whether this is top secret, confidential, for your eyes only, whatever your rating is, right? That's information classification. The management of risk is if I, for example, I worked for a large finance company at one point, and they had a global head of risk. And
Right.
he had a compliance team who worked for him and a risk assurance officer and a risk manager. And their job was to make sure that the organizational risk was monitored because they're in
Yeah.
such a highly regulated industry. So you have different types of risks. You've got your obligations under law, you've got your obligations under contract, you've got your reputational risk, and then you've got the risk of financial loss. And there's also obviously business continuity would result in any of those. So you have different types of risks. So when we talk about managing risks, we're talking about the generic risk management process or methodology or capability. We normally say that you have a risk method that you use to report to your board. So that this is a governance requirement, the GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. We're talking at that level.
Yeah.
So by applying information categorization to your data or your documents or your records, you're enabling risk management. You're making it easier, essentially. And if you were to label everything that had personal information, that would also, again, obviously make your compliance much easier and more thorough. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so the DMBOK refers to risk classification of data, and they talk about critical risk data, high risk data, and moderate risk data, and they go through a process of doing that risk classification, which a lot of times when I try to understand that in terms of because a lot of times you refer to the riskiest risks and POPIA and privacy, and this seems slightly different to that risk, those classifications. So I'm trying to position where this risk classification goes. I'll put it into the chat just to, I mean, I'm not sure if you've seen that before. I was interested where that.
Yeah, it's a thing. So if I look at the DAMA DMBOK and I look at ISO 27000 and I look at NIST, they will all have similar ideas. They all say that you need to, classify your information, you need to apply risk rating, you need to look at risk, you need to manage risk. However, they are not they have not defined risk. So ISO 27000 has a supporting document, ISO 27005, which is a risk methodology. However, it's based on ISO, I think, 31000. And the definition of risk management is a external discipline. It's a GRC function.
Right.
And things like data management, information security, they all need to support and plug into the organization's risk method. And what that means is that you might have a high, medium, low ranking. If the organization has a risk method with a 5 ranking, most organizations have 5 rankings of risk, from low to very high, and then normally assign them numbers. Right. Yeah. Part of the job of a compliance and risk or compliance officer is to marry up your information management procedures and understanding of risk classification and your information classifications and information security. Part of the job is to line those up. What POPIA is saying is you need to just have regard to risk management. That needs to be at the core of what you do. And fortunately, most information security frameworks have risk management at their core. But I think you're right. What you're touching on is that we very often miss the point that is not an ISO 27000 domain of expertise. They have borrowed from the risk management domain. And I would encourage everyone to join the Risk Management Association of South Africa. They have a lot of really good talks, free talks in Cape Town. If kind of envious, I can't go to them anymore. They were always having these free breakfast talks, and they would talk about risk. So like the head of ESCOM at that time came and gave a talk and said, this is how we handle risk. So yeah, it's an interesting topic on its own. Yeah.
Thanks. And then the last one is that ISO 27000, the general one. So that's not data privacy. That is just the general security practice. And I think Tom was interested in that.
You're talking about this one.
So that
that one.
The 27.
Yeah, that's the privacy management system approach. So it's like a quality management system for privacy specifically, and it also tackles security. And what it does is that it integrates the privacy layer onto ISO 27000. It's part of the same family. Yeah. So it expands. So for example, ISO 27000 wouldn't ordinarily be worried about For example, you might not worry about your test environment. If you're a software development company, you might not apply stringent controls to your test environment or test data, for example. Whereas
Right.
what ISO 27701 says is that if you've got personal information in there, then
Yeah.
your full
Yeah.
controls need to apply. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
All right.
Thank
So
you.
this is actually I'm kind of pulling out of a broader course that I've done for Know What Skills members to introduce ISO 27000. So what we're looking at now is an extract from part 2, which is where we outline what ISO 27000 requirements. So I'm pulling on that presentation just to make sense why it's a bit disjointed sometimes. But one of the things that I do in that course is I unpack what ISO is trying to achieve and how this maps with ISO 9000 and why ISO 27000 and ISO 20000 work together, and kind of go into quite a bit of depth and information and discussion about that. But for the purpose of this meeting, quality management is the heart of ISO 9000. ISO 9000 is the granddaddy of ISO 27000. And so when you look at compliance with ISO 27000, it's not really whether you've got a password management policy or whether you've got a clean desk policy or whether you've got a firewall. That's not what ISO 27000 is actually concerned about. What it wants you to have is a quality management process for the way that you manage information security. So let me just explain that for a second. First of all, it's cyclical, okay? It starts with, so these are literally the headings in ISO 27001. It starts with leadership, top-down leadership, demonstrating commitment to your information security management. Okay, so that's senior leadership. That's not your IT manager. That's your board of directors, CEO, leadership. Okay. Then there's a planning section, so that's one of the controls, and these are the things you've got to comply with if you want to qualify, if you want to get an ISO 27000 certification. There's a planning step, which unpacks what all the various things you need to do. The support is where you determine and provide the resources needed to implement and maintain security. So this is where we put money on the table and we dedicate time and we add security to people's role descriptions. So this is senior management supporting the initiative and supporting the effort. The operation is where when we typically think about information security, that's where that stuff happens. Except that in ISO 27000, the operation is really about risk assessment, risk treatment, and evaluating your performance. Risk assessment, risk treatment, and it's a cyclical thing of making sure that you have enough controls, and we'll dig into controls in a moment. Performance evaluation is a couple of things. It's your internal audit that's mandatory for ISO 27000. It's the monitoring of your security, making sure that you're obviously doing monitoring. And there's also a requirement for a management review, which is where the leadership at the top here get back into the detail and see reports on how this operation is going and whether there's enough support, and then it comes around again. So your performance evaluation, you identify improvements, things that you need to do better or changes that need to be addressed, and then you go back into your cycle. So this planning is the support is where the budget gets set. Planning is where you're setting your strategy. Leadership is where you're doing your feedback and reporting and getting feedback. So that if you had an ORAP, for example, an organizational risk assurance report, you would get feedback on that at the leadership step. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So having said all of that, here's a quick brief just for the record. Everything I just said. Leadership is setting policy, establishing commitments. That's where the information security policy comes in. We manage risks as part of our planning. In our support, we provide training and awareness and communication and documentation. The operation is assessment, risk assessment, and the application of controls as part of your risk treatment plan. Evaluating it, auditing, management review, and then an improvement, a continual improvement is the foundation and the basis of all of it. That's a foundation of any quality management system. So that's just a quick rundown there. I'm not going to spend too much time in that because we're going to talk about it again. But in POPIA, in Chapter 3, there's the conditions for lawful processing of personal information. And we have the cyclical process that ISO 27001, the standard, mandates you must have in order to be certified under ISO 27001. The POPI has a condition 1 is accountability, and that is satisfied by this top-down leadership requirement in ISO 27000. So you can see the mapping there. Condition 7, security safeguards. You need to take reasonable measures to identify all reasonably foreseeable risk. The planning step in ISO 27001 is literally about establishing your risk method. When we talk about establishing and maintaining appropriate safeguards against those risks, your support function is where you establish and maintain. That's where you give the training, you give the budget, you allocate responsibilities, you delegate. That's the support step to establish and maintain your ISMS, your information management plan. The operation step is where we are implementing and checking and monitoring our appropriate safeguards, in other words, the controls. We then regularly verify that the safeguards are effectively implemented, and that maps to the ISO 27000 requirement for performance evaluation. Then when POPI says that you have to ensure that the safeguards are continually updated in response to new risks or deficiencies, that maps to the improvement step in ISO 27000. So there's literally it's almost like they looked at ISO 27001 and wrote the POPI Act, which is, but like I said, it is quite generic. This is a very generic approach, and you'll see a very similar approach in all of in the NIST framework and in all of them actually. Okay.
Just a question there. When I talk to lots of the risk management people, they refer to identifying the risks and then defining the controls and the mitigation. Where does that mitigation come in? So I can see there your controls is equal to appropriate safeguards.
Yes, correct.
And then the mitigation. Where is
that? So
the
actual mitigation is this operation. That's the operation step. So that's where you are literally configuring your firewall, where you are writing your clean desk policy. So you're applying controls at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So now we're going to jump into the last section of that act and of this training course. Just a quick update, just for anybody who doesn't know, because one of the word control, security measures, controls, safeguards, it's all that we mean the same sorts of things, but it's a very broad category of stuff. And I think one of the barriers to information security for the rest of us is terminology. The terminology can become quite worrying. We were quite overloading. Yeah. But basically, security measures or controls are the things that you identify as being information security, but it's also the policies, the procedures, the background checks, the disciplinary procedures, the access controls, the approval, separation of duty to approve access to systems. All of those are controls. So those are things that we design and implement, and they're measurable. We can see whether they're working or not. It's a tangible thing. Okay. So if I'm an auditor and I'm asking you whether you are complying in terms of awareness training, what I'm going to ask you for is evidence of awareness training, and I'm going to want to see class, reports. And the information regulator would want the same. They would say to you, well, where's your POPI awareness training? Where's your information security awareness training? And they can look for evidence of that. So this evidence-based approach is much easier when you understand what your controls are. Okay. Just by the way, something that people miss is you have a policy that tells you the control must be there. Then you have the control and the SOP, the standard operating procedure or procedure to maintain and manage that control. So a lot of times missing in the middle is the process. The process is where you put the RACI grid, the RACI grid, responsible, accountable, and a delegation of responsibility to particular roles and functions. The process document is where you define how you're going to continually improve this activity. So it's not enough to have separation of duties for access control. That needs to be documented in a process, right? So the process is the step where I think there's a lot of design work and a lot of thinking work, and I think we often forget about processes as a control. Anyway, that's just my pulpit moment. Okay, so Any questions about what controls are, or is something a particular thing a control is? If anybody has any questions about that.
And then just
So again,
when you have PCI as an example,
mm,
all the auditing that of any access, both access violations and normal access, or just access that's successful, they also go to a point of view of the time that people were accessing the data. So is it during working hours? Is it after hours? And
yes.
then they go through a process of auditing those that are outside normal hours.
Yes.
Now, that's so the audit. So that audit is a control, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's a control, because
Well, I mean,
it's something that you've got to know that somebody's been given responsibility to do it, or there has to be a system that does it, and someone's got to monitor and check it.
yeah,
So, it's not going to happen by magic. Like, someone's got to be delegated that responsibility, and you define that in the process.
right. So it's no good just waiting for the PCI audit to come once a year. One should be checking that
No.
up every week or daily, or who accessed
Yes.
that.
Yeah, you've got to ask yourself whether you're doing it just to comply with you to get your PCI DSS certification, or are you
Yeah,
doing it because you actually want to protect the financial information that you're a custodian of.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. And by the way, that marries in very nicely to the event monitoring and incident management processes and policies
Yes.
of information of ISO 27000. So these things
Okay.
all talk to each other. They're not a million miles apart. Just for anyone who doesn't know, PCI is the payment card industry, and they have a standard called the PCI DSS, which is the payment card industry's data security standard. I think I'm
Yes.
correct on that.
Yes.
And they define a bunch of controls specifically for anyone handling credit cards and payment information. So yeah, and that's why we
And
have
I
payment
really,
gateways instead of coding
uh,
our own payment gateways.
uh, and I really liked the advice you gave one day to say, when we see that we have bank account numbers, then one can look to PCI to get some of those controls and definitions and copy from those,
Yeah.
what they do to control an account, a credit card, but we would use to control a bank account or whatever account we're
Exactly.
dealing with.
Yeah, so in POPI, the highest, the 10 million rand fine is applied to the way that you manage account numbers, financial account numbers.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
makes sense to look at something like PCI DSS to look for ideas for controls that you should maybe be putting over financial information or Bitcoin, or
Right.
whatever you have your crypto. The point is that at the beginning I said to you there's an awful lot of information security frameworks out there. They all define controls. As you've noticed, ISO 27000 is actually more concerned with the management process and the management oversight over the controls.
Okay.
But it also talks about controls, just not it's not the auditable standard. ISO 27001 is the standard that gets audited. And in ISO 27001, there's an Annex A where they start talking about things like policies, segregation of duties. This is literally the amount of information that is available to the auditor to audit you on. Right. So the auditor's not going to say to you, you must separate approval of access controls. That's not the point. But he's going to look for evidence of that. But segregation of duties to, conflicting duties and conflicting areas of responsibility shall be segregated. You apply that control to HR, to, access
Finance.
to systems.
Yeah.
Your information security roles and responsibilities is a type of control. Those need to be defined and written down. It doesn't tell you what those roles must be called or who must get the that responsibility. Nothing like that. It's a standard that can apply to any organization. So this is the extent of it. And I think when people unpack ISO 27001 for the first time, I think they're quite surprised at how little of the document is dedicated to security controls. The rest of the document is what you get audited on. It's the top-down buy-in, the management commitment. Have resources and have you planned for this? Have you reviewed it? Have you had a management review? That's the stuff that you get audited on mostly. Okay, but your risk assessment will say, you know what? In our world, access control is a big deal. That's a big risk for us. When the auditor sees that your risk assessment says that access control is a big deal for you, they're going to start looking for controls to mitigate that risk. it may or may not come from this table. You don't have to. You can use PCI DSS. You just say that that's what we reference. We decided PCI DSS is better for us than the Annex A and ISO 27000, and the auditor will say that sounds good. That's a sensible way to mitigate that risk. That's why you applied that risk, and you'll get through the audit. You don't have to use these things. This is not mandatory. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yep.
But the auditor has to have a standard way of auditing. So that's why this table exists, so that the auditor isn't just running, down rabbit holes and using their preferred standard.
Right.
And then the way that the auditor gives you advice, or like, let's say the auditor finds that your access controls are missing. What they're going to say to you to help you to improve it is they're going to reference the sister document of ISO 27001. They're going to look at ISO IEC 27002, which is the document that unpacks this table. So if you have a look at this extract here, here's the organizational controls policies for information security. This is unpacking what that control, the policies for information security. It gives you guidance on what the purpose should be. So it gives you more information. And if the auditor is going to tell you to do something better, they're going to look at this. They're going to say to you, this is what I recommend. They're not going to go and interrogate PCI DSS because that's random. It's got to be standardized because it's a standard audit. Okay. So you can use this as your cheat sheet too. If you're just getting out the starting gate, you can use this as a cheat sheet. But the point is, you don't have to implement everything that's in here. You don't have to implement all the controls. You do your risk assessment. Your risk assessment will prioritize where you need to focus your attention. You then look at your resources and what kind of what you can throw at that. You're not going to fix everything straight away. You're not going to mitigate all the risks straight away. You accept some risks. That's risk management. You accept some of the risks and you park them in an improvement plan. So as long as the missing stuff is in an improvement plan, you'll get through an ISO audit.
Okay.
The point is that you've got your eye on the ball. And if you could justify why you are prioritizing some things over other things, or why you're sort of paying lip service to one control, but really spending a lot of money on another control. Okay. So it's important to know that. And with POPI, that approach would apply because your POPI compliance, when the regulator comes to talk to you, they're going to say to you, you need to take cognizance of international standards. And you're going to say, well, this is how ISO 27000 thinks about it. So therefore, I can defend my position. I can defend my decision making. It's like, yes, we had a data breach, but we didn't foresee that risk as being that big. Look at our risk assessment. When we looked at the factors that were available to us at that time, we rated that as a low risk. And now it turns out it wasn't a very low risk. And now it turns out it was actually quite a high risk. That's our bad. We need to fix that and mitigate that. So the regulator will come to you and tell you to mitigate and to fix the broken stuff, right? So just to a bit of completeness there, the Annex A controls, they divided up into people controls, so things that people's behaviors, their roles and responsibilities, terms and conditions of employment, that type of thing. Then you have your physical controls, and these are quite tangible. These are like what you do with your laptops when you dispose of them. Your technology controls, which, is, as you imagine, it's the stuff that we normally think about when we think about IT systems.
And that would come into the PET, didn't we? That privacy enabling technology, that would come in there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So PETs are your building PETs frameworks and stuff as well would also go in there. Your privacy by design. If you're building software, a lot of your technological controls will be on your software development lifecycle process. Or the way you design your system. Privacy by design would be in the way you design your system. So it all goes in there. And then organizational is really just, as I said, the misleadingly named catch-all. It's just like everything that didn't fit nicely, like access control, because access is a people thing, it's a physical thing, and it's a technology thing. So you can't really pick hole that too much. So let's just go back for a second. So the role of Annex A in the ISMS, in the process of managing ISMS, is you have controls is not something that leadership worries about. Okay,
Yeah.
so controls leadership that is worried about the risk assessment, not whether the controls, what the controls are. You're not going to ask your CEO to understand the intricacies of your firewall configuration. He just wants to know, she just wants to know, are we protected from intrude, are we protected enough to prevent unauthorized access? So where your Annex A and your selection of controls and your PCI DSS start coming into play is you select the controls that will address the risks that you identify during the planning phase. Then you go into your support phase, your establish and maintain phase, where you, let's say, for example, you decide, oh, we need to implement, I don't know, a firewall. Somebody in the organization has to be trained up on how that firewall works. You've got to select a firewall, you've got to buy it, you've got to pay for it. Someone's got to give them responsibility for monitoring the logs. Like you've got to have separation of duties so that your devs can't open up a test port, which, by the way, is one way that one of my customers got hacked. It was a test, it's an admin level test account on the firewall was left behind. So that's establish and maintain in this process of managing information security. Then in your operation phase, what you're doing is you're implementing and managing the controls. You're documenting your standard operating procedures. You're managing change. You're doing change authorization. And that's your operation step, right? Where you're now monitoring. You do, and for example, you would do a physical audit of your firewall to make sure that there aren't any weird accounts given too much access in your firewall. And then your performance evaluation is where you are auditing controls are effective, and the management review meeting is where you get your IT manager and your COO and your CFO in the room, and you say, hey, are we achieving the things we thought we were going to achieve when we started with our risk planning? Are we actually mitigating our risks? And an internal audit should be done, obviously, by somebody who is not marking their own homework. There's a whole ISO standard on internal audits, by the way. So you can, so that's another whole thing. And then obviously your improvement is where you address the gaps. So if your controls are not effective, if your performance evaluation tells you that actually someone was allowed to make a change to your firewall and nobody noticed, that's a problem. If somebody's able to wedge open the door to your server room, that's a problem, or to your office for that matter. You need to then address those gaps. And how do you do it? By applying controls.
Yep.
Right, so the two together, there we have it.
Wouldn't you first, you got to get all the risks defined around that, or because I'm assuming at a high level you say, okay, that risk is, we don't need to worry about it now, but as soon as you say we do need to worry about it, then you're going to go through that more detailed planning around that risk and the support and the controls that need to go in place.
What you're doing in your performance evaluation is you're looking at, so with risk, when you do a risk analysis, you end up with your inherent risk, which is out of the box. What is the risk? Once I've implemented my controls in the operation step, I have mitigated that risk to some extent.
Okay.
You can never fully mitigate it, but you've mitigated it to some extent.
You reduced it.
And you've reduced the risk. So what you end up with is your residual risk. Yeah. And it's helpful to know this language because this is the language that your CEO has to use to talk to the board or to your investors. That's the language they talk about. So you can't say we're protected from malware. You can only say, according to our risk tolerance, we are adequately mitigating malware based on how much money and time we want to spend on that and how much risk we think it actually presents to our organization. Yeah. So if we don't think that that is a high inherent risk, I'm not going to spend a lot of money on that, right? And because that's my risk tolerance, my CEO said, look, this is not something I'm worried about. Okay, so I'm not going to put money in that.
Yeah.
And that's the reason risk is so important, because it's how do you juggle your scarce resources and yet be effective enough in the way that you control your information security. And that risk tolerance, by the way, there's a nice clever little methodology on that, of how you indicate that you're red, amber, green, how you assign it.
That's right.
Yeah. And this is where your privacy compliance monitoring. So if you're using OneTrust to manage your privacy compliance, they have their own way of managing a risk method. Then you've got your ISO 27000 or information security or CISO or whatever, like, or somebody's doing vulnerability scans or penetration tests, and they're coming up with high, medium, low, red, amber, green risks. So now you've got your OneTrust with red, amber, green risks, and you've got your penetration test vulnerability assessment with red, amber, green risks. And your board have got a financial, they're applying their risk method to their financial risk and their reputation risk. Marketing is looking at reputation risk, and everyone has a red, amber, green. But red, amber, and green, high, medium, low could mean completely different things to different people. So for one of my customers, a 10 million rand fine was literally pocket change for them. Hard to imagine, but it was literally pocket change for them. So for them, that didn't even hit the board report because they were only interested in their high risk bucket. That 10 million rand fine didn't even make it into the low risk bucket.
Yeah.
So it really depends on the context of the organization, which is the starting point of ISO 27000.
Yeah.
So yeah, this leadership step is actually where you establish the context of the organization. What really matters to us? How much can we pay? Our approach to risk, do we wait for it to happen and then address it, or are we very proactive? So like one of my other customers deals with a lot of really sensitive information. They spend a lot of money on managing their privacy and making sure that their privacy controls are 100%. So there's a very different risk appetite between just two of my own customers. And I think information security officers and privacy officers and compliance people get it wrong when they talk to senior management, because for them everything is high risk. We've got to have all the security controls. We've got to comply with the whole of PCI DSS. We have to throw 10 million rand at our malware protection. It's like, that's not the way that that's not the risk management approach. You need to talk in terms of risk and accept that your organization has got a risk tolerance. Now, when it comes to POPI, that risk tolerance should include the impact on the individual who's impacted if that data gets out. So you should expand your organizational risk tolerance to consider what the impact would be on the individual person if their data got out. So it's maybe not a big deal to you that you're maintaining the HIV status of somebody, but if that got out into some communities, that could be a life-changing event.
No, I suppose there's a double-edged sword there, because if you have a breach or you do expose it, then you have reputational risk. You can't.
Yes.
You can't treat them completely separately. The one's going to lead to the other. And
that's why your information security guy has got to be talking to, and your privacy privacy compliance people have to be talking to your marketing managers. So privacy was so difficult to implement because you had to get everyone to talk to each other and agree on stuff. Reputation risk is the domain of marketing. And it is something that gets monitored and managed at the board level, for sure. But if you want to get approval to spend a lot of money on an information security control or system, do your risk assessment and demonstrate reputational risk in a high, medium, low risk ranking that the marketing officer or the marketing manager understands.
Yes.
You see what I mean? So the risk management methodology has got to be the common language between all the different parts of the business. It's the core. So just to close out, just so that previous slide, this is the ISMS process supporting compliance. So this is ISO 27001. And then the role of Annex A in the ISMS process, that we are doing, we're implementing managing controls, we're auditing controls, we're reviewing controls, we're addressing gaps in our controls, and we're assessing the effectiveness of our controls. That's what a vulnerability test is, or a penetration test. So if you look at it as a map of a process, that makes a big difference. And that's all I have to say about that. 1 minute to 5.
So now, won't you help me there in terms of, you mentioned the missing process leg, so policy process, in that if we go back to that diagram, where would that?
So this one.
You had, with all the details there, with enable, maintain. I think it was the second last slide, I think. With the standard operating procedures. So I just wanted to compare, there's
sorry.
your document SOPs at operation level.
Yes.
So now when we talk about documenting the roles and responsibilities, that RACI that you were talking about, then are you talking at the support level? That's your resources and competency and
process. Your policies happen at leadership level.
yeah, that's correct.
Policies are
Or
direction
planning
from leaders.
Okay,
so it's actually at your
that's
planning stage that you look at process.
right. Okay.
Because you design the way you want to manage stuff, and then you ask for budget.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you might find that you don't have a particular competence. You're going to have to hire someone, and that's a budget impact.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Great.
Okay, cool. Good.
Thanks. I'm sure Don was quite interested in this because I think he's been challenged quite often to check what level of security he has. Don, I'm sure I think your hand's up already. Any questions from your side? I'm sure there are.
Thank you for that, Carolyn. I really enjoyed the presentation. I guess my question is, there seems to be, depending on the stage that that company is in, I wonder how much discretion you have in terms of meeting the ISO standards, whether they are, and the appropriateness of ISO standards for companies that are at different phases of maturity. So how do the regulators think about this? And how should one think about phasing one's maturity development towards the compliance to specific ISO standards? As depending on the kind of state of the maturity of the company that you are with.
Yeah, so you've raised two important things there. The maturity facet. So first of all, just talk about ISO 27000 as a standard. That's a standard. It's a capability. So it's like saying, do you have the capability to manage your access? And that's a yes/no question, right? Maturity is how well are you doing that? Are you doing that, discussion between three people, you figure out what access is required, you implement it, it's done. No point writing it all down because you three people who sit in the same office and you talk to each other every day. If it's effective and that's mitigating the risk, I don't see a problem with that. The point is that you have some evidence that you had that discussion and that you have actually paid some attention to it. So things like meeting minutes become kind of important, and that's where recording meetings or Teams meetings and stuff are really handy because they become the evidence that you did discuss this stuff. So you did your due diligence, you did, pay mind to it. ISO 27001 itself and POPIA itself are not maturity assessments. They don't insist that you have a system or that you automate or that you're data driven. If that risk is not, if you can handle that risk very cheaply and effectively, given your resources that you have available to you, and you can defend your position on that, then there's nothing in POPIA that says there's nothing that's absolute. What I would say though is that defendability, so what I call that taking a defensible position, right? So whatever decisions you make must be defensible. So and if even imagine worst case scenarios that you're defending yourself in court, right? So you're making a defensible position in court. There are enough protocols and guidelines in NIST, for example, or in the CIS, and there's a number of frameworks where they talk about, they risk rank things, although they risk weight controls, and they'll say, if you don't do this minimum level of that's just negligence, right? And there's a generally accepted sort of idea that there's a minimum amount of controls that are just, if you don't have that, you're just, in a modern organization, you're just being negligent. Then they have the controls, so they risk weight them. And there is actually a fantastic resource that kind of combines all of this and gives you a nice overview of everything. I'll put it in the chat window. And I rely on that heavily. It's the secure controls framework, security controls framework. Geez. That one. So here's and they have a spreadsheet that you can download for free. I can't do the chat, Howard. It's the securecontrolsframework.com, literally. That's the control. If you download that spreadsheet and have a look at that, you'll see that they literally risk rank all of the controls that have ever been applied to anybody in the whole world. And then what you do is, let's say, for example, you're starting out, what you do is look at the risk level, maybe 9 and 10. And you would document that as your strategy. That's our strategy. We're going to do risk level 9 and 10. Then we're going to look at it, and then we're going to filter out all the stuff that's not relevant to us because we don't have a physical server room. So physical controls are not a big deal. Or we all work from home, so that's not a big deal. So you filter out all of that. But the point is that process of thinking, the way that you're handling your risk, the way that you're assessing risk and managing risk needs to be at least documented how you got to that point, so that you can defend it in a court of law. You don't want to be standing in a court of law 5 years down the line and going, oh, and I'm pretty sure we thought about this at the time, but I can't remember why we did it this way. That's not gonna that's not gonna help you. So yeah.
Great. If I could ask a follow-up.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely.
It also made me think of the risk of litigation and I wonder, is this an area where there's been an insurance market that has developed? And I'm interested in, is there an insurance market in South Africa that as an enterprise one could take out insurance to protect oneself?
Yes, your cyber insurance and your professional indemnity insurance. Howard, you would know about that more than I would.
Yeah.
How effective they are and whether they really help you is another story. I think you really have to read the fine print. I did see a policy once. Someone asked me to help them to get their cyber insurance sorted out, and they'd opted for a indemnity insurance or something instead of a cyber insurance. And one of the caveats in it, one of the bits of fine print, was that if the data breach was was caused by criminal activity, that the insurance, it doesn't need to pay out. That basically it's out of scope. And I was like, well, all security events are pretty much criminal activity. So in other words, they're only covering you for accidents, so for employees flubbing, that's what they're covering you for. So you got to kind of watch out for that a little bit.
Caroline, could you try and put that into the chat now? I changed that chat.
Yeah. And by the way, the secure controls framework sort of also shows you, it consolidates all of the different standards. And it also gives you a maturity rating. So it also says, if you're maturity level 1, this is what this control would look like. If you're maturity level 2, this is what the control will look like. So that can be quite a handy tool as well, especially when it comes to investment. Do we need to automate this, or is it okay if we manually monitor? It's quite a nice tool.
So is that on the capability maturity model?
They've integrated that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they've integrated the capability maturity model into the SCF. It's really just a superset of a normalized view of all of the standards. And they've mapped it to the NIST cycle, and it's really nice.
Great. Any other questions? Ondo, anything from you, sir? You've been quiet. Normally you've got lots of questions. Still quiet.
All right. Well, we are 10 past, so yeah.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Thanks a lot for everything.
Very welcome.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, thanks everybody for attending, and thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much
for the opportunity.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Cheers.